At her own brother's funeral, 17-year-old Rebecca, a brave autistic teen, was shoved off the podium mid-eulogy by the HOA president herself. Deborah Langford had spent years bullying the neighborhood behind a polished smile and a stack of rule books. But this time, she went too far. What she didn't know, Rebecca's father wasn't just grieving. He was a legal expert with a plan. But just wait until you see how this courtroom drama unfolds, and why, in the end, justice didn't just whisper, it roared. The church was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that settles when something sacred is about to happen, or already has. Outside, the world kept moving. Birds sang, cars passed, trees rustled in the breeze. But inside, time had stopped. Every pew was filled, but no one dared speak. The air carried the heavy, sweet scent of lilies, too many lilies, and the grief was thick, clinging to skin like humidity on a summer day. Somewhere near the altar, a candle flickered violently and then went still. The organ had long gone silent. Rebecca stood at the podium, alone. She looked so small there, her frame rigid, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the sides of the wooden stand. She didn't look at the people. Couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the photo just to her left, her twin brother, Mason, smiling in a navy blue hoodie, taken just 3 months before his heart gave out. Her lips moved, barely at first, as if trying to find the courage to push sound through. On her wrist hung a delicate silver bracelet, worn and clearly loved. It bore a single name, Mason. Her fingers brushed over it again and again, like a lifeline. Rebecca was autistic. She didn't like loud noises, crowds, or unfamiliar situations. Public speaking for her wasn't just scary, it was Everest, a mountain of panic and noise and uninvited eyes. And yet, here she was, because Mason had always told her she had the bravest heart he'd ever seen. And now she needed to speak for him, to say goodbye, in her own words. Her voice cracked on the second sentence, but it kept going. What came out was soft, raw, unpolished, but true. Every word was stitched with pain and love. She spoke about how he always waited for her after class, how he learned sign language just to tell her jokes in silence, how he once stood between her and a group of bullies in middle school and told them, "You'll never be half as human as she is." The audience sat motionless. Some were already crying. Then the back doors of the church flew open with a loud clack. A figure stormed in, sharp and fast, heels hitting the floor like pistol shots. The sound was completely out of place, too aggressive for a space so drenched in mourning. Deborah Langford, president of the HOA, self-declared protector of neighborhood standards. Mason's neighbor, the same woman who once left 6 handwritten notes in his mailbox for inappropriate Christmas decor because his lights blinked after 9 p.m. People whispered her name in disbelief as she made her way down the aisle like she owned the place. Rebecca's voice faltered. She looked up, confused. Deborah didn't slow down. She marched straight to the front, clutching a glossy leather folder to her chest like a weapon. "Stop this circus," she snapped. Loud, sharp, cold. Gasps rippled through the room. A pastor stepped forward, unsure, lifting a hand in protest. And then it happened. Without a word, without a pause, Deborah reached out and shoved Rebecca. Not hard, but not gently either, like swatting away a child or brushing a bug off a coat. Rebecca lost her balance, her arm slipping from the podium's edge. Her body twisted, graceless, and she hit the ground with a hollow thud, her temple grazing the sharp edge of the wooden base. The microphone let out a high-pitched squeal, then went silent. A sound escaped her, small, barely audible. A whimper. Then she curled inward, knees to chest, hands over her head, like she had to hide. The church went dead silent. Deborah stepped past her and grabbed the microphone with manicured fingers. "This is a respectable neighborhood," she said, adjusting the mic like she was hosting a PTA meeting. "We don't let mentally unstable people make speeches, not at a public event." And that was it. That was the moment something inside me, Rebecca's father, snapped. I stood. Not fast, not loud, but people turned because they could feel it, that heat, that pressure. No one had ever laid a hand on my daughter before. Not like that. Not with such deliberate cruelty. She was my world. And this woman, this cold, arrogant, rule-drunk nobody, had just shoved her like she was in the way, like she didn't belong. And in that moment, I knew two things with absolute clarity. One, Deborah Langford had no idea what she had just started. Two, I was going to take everything from her. That night, the hospital smelled of antiseptic and sadness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, cold and clinical. Rebecca lay curled on the narrow bed, a white band of gauze just above her eyebrow, a dull bruise forming on the side of her face where bone met podium. Machines beeped softly nearby, but she wasn't hooked up to any of them. Her pain wasn't the kind wires could detect. She hadn't spoken since the incident, not a single word. She sat upright, knees drawn to her chest, the hospital blanket bunched at her waist. Her fingers never left the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one engraved with Mason. She traced it over and over, as if memorizing the metal by touch could anchor her to something familiar. Tears ran silently down her cheeks, but she never wiped them away. They just fell, slow and steady, disappearing into the fabric of her gown. Her father stood nearby, unmoving. He had never felt so useless in his life. There was no fixing this. No kiss on the forehead, no bedtime story, no dumb dad joke that could pull her out of that hole. He wanted to scream, but the rage that boiled inside him was the quiet kind, the one that builds under pressure until it becomes volcanic. His fists clenched in his pockets, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. He was trying not to fall apart. The doctors had confirmed it, mild concussion, emotional trauma. She'd be physically fine, but emotionally? That was another story. Then came the knock on the door. 2 officers. They were professional, calm, and respectful. They asked questions. He answered. A report was filed. There would be an investigation. He nodded. Rebecca didn't look up once. And just when the night couldn't sink any lower, his phone rang. Deborah Langford. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he answered. Her voice was smooth, practiced, hollow. I think we should just let this go, she said, with the calm arrogance of someone who'd spent years dodging consequences. She's fragile. Maybe she just tripped. We don't want to escalate things, do we? He didn't respond, just let her talk, and recorded every word, not out of malice, out of instinct. The next morning, the letter came from the HOA, a formal email signed by 3 board members, 2 of whom had attended the funeral and said nothing when Rebecca hit the floor. The statement was clinical, sanitized. A masterpiece of bureaucratic gaslighting. It read, "We regret the unfortunate disruption caused during the community-sanctioned service and extend sympathy to all attendees. However, we must express concern over Miss Rebecca Callahan's behavior, which led to the altercation." Let that sink in. They blamed her, a 17-year-old autistic girl mourning her dead twin, for disrupting a funeral, her own brother's funeral. It wasn't just about Deborah anymore. It never had been. It was about the entire rotting infrastructure that allowed people like her to thrive. About the fake civility of neighborhood committees that operated like tiny tyrannies, hiding behind bylaws and petty rules to maintain their control. About people who weaponized decorum to crush anything that didn't fit their narrow version of acceptable. The board, the system, the fake smiles, the way they all sat in silence when it happened. They thought they could sweep it under a rug like it was another noise complaint or trash bin violation. Like his daughter's pain was just an inconvenience to their spotless little HOA record. But they didn't know him. They didn't know what kind of man raises a daughter like Rebecca, fierce, brave, brilliant, and gentle all at once. They didn't know that behind his grief stood 20 years of legal expertise, a deep understanding of procedural law, and contacts in state and federal offices. And they sure as hell didn't know what it looks like when a father, calm, patient, professional, decides it's time to make someone pay. Deborah Langford had touched the untouchable, pushed the wrong child at the worst possible moment, and she wasn't going to lose her title. She was going to lose everything. He started digging the very next morning, not out of vengeance, at least not at first. It was instinct, survival, When everything else felt like it was spiraling, he needed control, structure, a plan. Her name was Deborah Langford, HOA president for 8 straight years. The kind of tenure only bullies maintain, quiet ones, the kind who smile while writing up citations for excessively festive Halloween decor. He pulled public records, took less than 30 minutes to start connecting dots. 37 complaints filed against her during her tenure, most dismissed without investigation, but the language was consistent: harassment, intimidation, abuse of authority. 4 separate civil suits for harassment, all settled quietly out of court. 1 active restraining order, sealed. But he had friends. Law school never gave him power, it gave him connections. 1 phone call and a trusted former colleague confirmed what the court wouldn't say on record. Deborah Langford had been under scrutiny for years, for threats, for coercion, for terrorizing homeowners behind a polished grin and legalese. He wasn't just a grieving father, he was a litigation analyst for a civil rights firm, and that woman had laid hands on the wrong child. Next, the church. He'd noticed cameras when they arrived that day, small, discreet, likely overlooked by most. He returned, politely requested the footage from the church's administrator, and reviewed it alone. The moment played out with sickening clarity. Rebecca, mid-sentence, vulnerable, brave, shoved violently to the floor by a woman twice her size. The audio caught the gasp, the impact, the silence. It was indisputable. It was assault. And now it was evidence. He backed the video up in 3 places, encrypted it, time-stamped it, added it to the file he was already building. Then came the HOA documents. He knew what to look for, knew how petty power gets funded, quietly through vague line items and shuffled accounts. There it was, a fund labeled Neighborhood Aesthetic Maintenance. The description was vague, almost poetic, but the disbursements, every check, every payment, every contractor led to her, landscaping firms with ties to her nephew, a stonework crew that rebuilt her patio, invoices marked as beautification efforts routed directly to her home. She was using HOA fines collected from residents under threats of liens to renovate her backyard. Translation: she'd been stealing from retirees, from single parents, from homeowners fined $200 for wind chimes in violation of tonal guidelines. He cross-referenced addresses, matched contractors, pulled bank records. It was all there, so now he had physical assault on a minor abuse of HOA authority, financial fraud, and misappropriation of community funds. He didn't scream, didn't post. He simply sat down and began building a case. Every page was labeled, every timestamp exact, every section supported by law. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice, real justice, legal justice, because Deborah Langford had built her power behind paper, behind bylaws, behind systems no one thought to question. So he'd use those same systems to destroy her. And when he was finished, she wouldn't just lose her title, she'd lose everything. He didn't plan a media campaign. He didn't issue a statement. No dramatic text overlay, no hashtags, just the truth. He uploaded the video, 1 tweet, no caption, no commentary. Just 27 seconds of raw footage. Deborah Langford marching down the church aisle, shoving a grieving autistic teenager mid-eulogy, and seizing the microphone like she was entitled to the silence of a funeral she didn't even belong to. The video spoke for itself. In 2 hours, it hit 50,000 views. By 4, it had crossed 1 million. By midnight, it was on national news. The internet did what it does best. People were furious. #justice. For Rebecca started trending within 12 hours. Autism advocacy groups issued statements. Civil rights lawyers began stitching commentary to the footage. Celebrities, real ones, retweeted it with their own outrage. And there was Rebecca's name, over and over, spoken with tenderness by strangers who had never met her but now stood beside her like an army. He hadn't expected it to move this fast. But once truth touches rage, it spreads like wildfire. Deborah panicked. By the next morning, she was at a podium, standing in front of the HOA's beige brick building, flanked by 2 attorneys and a backdrop that screamed community values. Her hair was pulled tight, her pearls perfectly aligned. She cleared her throat and said, "This has been a tragic misunderstanding. I was simply trying to maintain order and safety during an emotionally charged event. Things escalated." She spoke like she was the one who had been wounded, like she deserved sympathy. Not once did she say Rebecca's name. Not once did she apologize to the girl she'd assaulted. He waited for her statement to finish. Then he posted the voicemail, the one she left him that very night after the hospital visit, the one where she said, "She's mentally unstable. Maybe she just tripped. Let's not escalate this." Her voice was calm, dismissive, almost bored. He didn't add context, just posted the audio without the timestamp. The comments section turned volcanic. There was no walking this back. Within 48 hours, the mayor released a statement condemning her actions, calling the video a disturbing violation of decency and human dignity. News outlets dug into her HOA tenure. Journalists found the same fraud he had. Residents came forward. Testimonies flooded in. Stories of harassment, humiliation, manipulation. By the end of the week, the HOA board suspended her pending formal investigation. Her access to community funds was frozen. Her email accounts were deactivated. Her name was scrubbed from the HOA website. But that wasn't enough. He wasn't here for reputation damage. He was here for accountability. He met with his legal team that Friday, brought the footage, the voicemail, the financial records, the list of complaints, and the notarized testimony from the church administrator. They didn't even blink. "We can move forward," the lead attorney said. "Not civil charges, not HOA arbitration, criminal charges, the kind that don't get settled quietly behind glass doors, the kind that come with mugshots." He signed the paperwork. The case was real now, official, filed, entered into the system. She would be subpoenaed. She would have to stand in court and face what she had done, not just to Rebecca, to every person she had bullied and silenced with HOA bylaws and polite threats disguised as policy. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply closed the file and said, "Let's proceed." Because justice wasn't an online storm. Justice was slow, legal, permanent. And it had just begun. Deborah Langford walked into the courtroom like it was a stage she'd owned for years. She sat at the defense table with her back straight, her chin slightly lifted. Her lipstick was the exact shade of controlled aggression, her gray blonde hair lacquered into something closer to armor than style. She wore a fitted blazer with a flag pin and clutched a leather-bound planner she hadn't opened once. She looked like she thought she still had power. The judge entered. The jury took their places. The gallery filled with neighbors, reporters, parents, HOA board members with suddenly excellent posture. Her lawyer stood, a man with a permanent smirk and a tie too shiny for a courtroom. He began painting a narrative that Rebecca was emotionally volatile, that her mental state may have distorted her perception, that this was all an unfortunate misunderstanding, amplified by social media hysteria. It was a mistake. Rebecca was called to the stand. She rose slowly from the front bench, walked with a careful step to the witness box. The court clerk swore her in, and she sat, stiff, pale, hands gripping the hem of her blazer like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. She didn't speak for a moment. The room was quiet enough to hear her swallow. Then she began. Her voice shook, her breathing hitched. But she kept going. She described the funeral, the speech, the moment she saw Deborah walk down the aisle, the shove, the fall, the silence afterward. How she thought, for a second, she might die right there on the carpeted floor with everyone watching. She didn't cry, not once. And as she spoke, something changed. Her words stopped trembling. They sharpened. Each one landed with weight, clean and painful. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every time someone like Deborah decided their comfort mattered more than someone else's dignity. Then the prosecutor rolled in the screen. The courtroom dimmed, the footage played. It was the same video seen by millions, but now it was in slow motion, high definition, and in front of 12 silent jurors. It showed everything. Deborah's approach, her outstretched arm, the deliberate shove, Rebecca hitting the floor, the mic in Deborah's hand a moment later. The gasp came at the exact second it always did. Someone in the gallery muttered a curse under their breath. One juror, a middle-aged woman in glasses, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Deborah looked away. It was the first time she didn't look smug, the first time she looked small. But the prosecution wasn't finished. They called one last witness, the former HOA treasurer. A quiet man in a beige suit with an overstuffed briefcase. He sat down, opened it, and began handing over documents. He spoke calmly, clearly, said Deborah had threatened board members into silence, said she'd personally rewritten bylaws to find specific homeowners she didn't like the vibe of, said she funneled money from HOA fees into projects on her own property, and threatened to blacklist any contractor who refused to fake the invoices. The evidence? Emails, contracts, bank records, receipts, literal ones. Deborah's attorney tried to object. The judge overruled him again and again. By the end of testimony, there was no doubt. Not just about the shove, about everything. The judge leaned forward, looking straight at Deborah. His voice was calm, almost tired. Miss Langford, based on the testimony and evidence presented, I am ordering you into custody pending formal sentencing. Bail is denied. The room held its breath. Deborah stood, slowly at first, as the bailiff approached. Her voice cracked. Wait, you can't do this. I was protecting the community. The cuffs clicked around her wrists. She screamed. A sound sharp enough to echo through the wood-paneled walls and the stained glass windows and into the quiet morning beyond. Rebecca didn't flinch. Her father didn't blink. Justice, at last, had a sound. And it came with metal and silence, and the fall of someone who thought they'd never be caught. With Deborah Langford in custody, the facade began to crack. First, it was the silence. The HOA board held no emergency meeting, no email, no statement, just a stunned pause, as if the machine had lost its battery. Then came the resignations, quiet at first, a treasurer, then a vice president, then 3 more members within 48 hours, no explanations, just folded chairs and deleted email addresses. The collapse had begun, and now that the queen had fallen, the subjects began to speak. For years, residents had whispered behind closed doors, over fences, at school pickups and supermarket aisles. Stories traded in hushed tones, always ending with the same line, but there's nothing we can do. Now, they lined up. They came to the legal office, called the hotline, emailed his firm, dozens at first, then hundreds, a flood. One man described being fined $2,000 for repainting his mailbox, a shade that was non-compliant with community standards. He showed photos. The difference between his paint and the approved tone was nearly invisible to the human eye. An elderly woman said Deborah had forced her to dig up a rose garden planted by her late husband. The letter claimed it was too emotionally provocative for neighbors. A single mother had been fined for letting her autistic son play with chalk on their driveway. The HOA called it graffiti. It wasn't just petty. It wasn't just controlling. It was psychological warfare, waged with paperwork and signatures and hollow smiles. A campaign of intimidation dressed up in khakis and committee minutes. Order, they'd called it. But order had become a weapon, and Deborah had wielded it with surgical cruelty. She hadn't ruled like a president. She'd ruled like a tyrant. And the board had helped her, whether out of fear, complicity, or laziness. They'd watched it happen, enabled it, approved her budgets, voted yes to her punishments, nodded along during her meetings as she reduced people to infractions and violations. But now they were scrambling to save themselves. The HOA's lawyer issued a public statement within a week. We are cooperating with all investigations and deeply regret any harm caused under previous leadership. The phrase previous leadership was doing a lot of work. County officials launched an audit. The HOA's accounts were frozen. An interim board was formed, composed of members who had never once served under Deborah's term. Residents demanded rewrites of the bylaws. They held a town hall that spilled out into the parking lot. People brought folders, photos, memories. It was cathartic, angry, hopeful. The same community that once flinched at Deborah's voice was now begging for change. And yet, for him, for Rebecca, it wasn't over. Because this was never just about exposing a corrupt HOA. It was about dismantling the very idea that silence was safer than truth. That conformity was more valuable than compassion. That a teenage girl's voice could be shoved aside without consequence, in life, in mourning, or in law. So, while the neighborhood rebuilt itself and the board tried to rewrite its image, he kept going. He compiled every testimony. He tracked every financial lead. He reached out to the state attorney general's office, who had already taken notice. Deborah was behind bars, but the machine she built, he would burn that too. down to the screws. The courtroom was full, not just seated, packed. Every bench, every corner, every standing spot near the exit held someone who had watched the story unfold and came to see how it ended. Some were neighbors, some strangers, a few were reporters, but most were people who had lived under Deborah Langford's rule, quietly hoping one day they'd see this. Rebecca sat beside her father, dressed in soft blue. The color matched her eyes, though they stayed downcast. Around her wrist was the silver bracelet with Mason engraved on the surface, slightly worn now from being touched so often, held so tightly. She reached for her father's hand, and he gave it without hesitation. It was quiet, a different kind of silence than the one at Mason's funeral. This silence was waiting, steady, powerful. The judge entered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone was level, but the words landed like thunder. Deborah Langford, you have been found guilty of assault on a minor, malicious intent in a place of public mourning, and willful abuse of power as a homeowners association president. A pause. You are hereby sentenced to 18 months in state prison. Your right to serve in any official HOA capacity is permanently revoked. It was done. Deborah didn't cry. No collapse. No outburst. She sat still, blinking far too fast, her mouth parted just slightly, like she was waiting for someone to interrupt, to fix it, to tell her it had all been a mistake. But no one did. The court officer approached. She stood up, her motions robotic. Her wrists were cuffed behind her back, gently but firmly. The chains made the faintest sound, steel tapping against authority, and just like that, she was walked out. No words, no audience, no more control. Her name wouldn't be on the HOA letters anymore. No more fines, no more veiled threats in official font, no more thin smiles hiding poison. He didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't victory in the way movies show it. No fist raised, no swelling music. It was quieter than that. He felt peace, not the kind that wipes the pain away, but the kind that says, you did everything you could. You stood up. You protected what mattered. And as he looked to his right, he saw the real reason he came this far. Rebecca. She wasn't shaking, wasn't crying. Her breathing was even. Her eyes were steady. For months, she had lived in the shadow of that moment. The shove, the fall, the silence. She had been humiliated, hurt, disbelieved. But she had also stood in that very courtroom, taken the oath, and told the truth, even when her voice trembled. He saw something in her gaze now that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just relief, it was power. Not loud, not dramatic, but real, earned. The power of someone who survived. The judge's gavel fell once. Court was adjourned. People began to stand, gathering their coats and belongings. Conversations started to buzz, but he and Rebecca stayed seated for a moment longer. He didn't rush her. She didn't rush herself. Eventually, she looked up at him. No words. Just a small nod. A quiet kind of closure. And in that single subtle gesture, more than any verdict or sentence, he knew it was over, and that his daughter, who had once whispered at the podium, now stood taller than anyone in the room. Months passed. The media storm faded, the headlines disappeared, and the town slowly returned to its rhythm. But nothing truly went back to how it was. Rebecca didn't either. She joined a nonprofit focused on helping autistic teens with public speaking. A local chapter at first, then regional. At every event, she stood in front of rooms full of strangers, libraries, school gyms, auditoriums, and told her story. Not about what was done to her, but about what came after. About courage, about grief, about standing back up when the world tries to knock you flat. Her voice was still quiet, but now it carried weight, intent. People listened. They didn't listen because she was a victim. They listened because she had something to say. She never spoke about Deborah directly. Never needed to. Her message wasn't about revenge. It was about resilience. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the HOA underwent its own kind of reckoning. The bylaws were rewritten from the ground up. Language once used to intimidate was stripped out. New leadership was elected. People who actually listened, who spoke in plain words instead of veiled threats. Transparency policies were adopted, An annual audit was mandated. Mental health accommodations were added to the community charter. Things that never should have been missing were finally put in place. It didn't fix the past, but it changed the future. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact at the mailbox now spoke freely. Some apologized. Others offered stories of their own, small pieces of truth that for years had been swallowed in silence. He still missed Mason every day. Some mornings it hit without warning, passing his room, hearing a song on the radio, seeing a shadow that looked too familiar. Grief, it turned out, wasn't something you healed from. It just changed shape. But even through that pain, he could see what Mason had left behind. His sister, once quiet, anxious, unsure, had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into something fierce, something brave. She hadn't just survived, she had grown. She had led. As for Deborah Langford, she spent her days scrubbing tile and emptying trash cans in a medium security prison. She wore beige, no pearls, no title, no power, just another inmate in a place that didn't care about community meetings, newsletter deadlines, or citations for non-compliant shrubbery. She had once ruled a neighborhood. Now she cleaned the corners of a world that didn't flinch at her stare. And if she ever thought about Rebecca, if she ever remembered that church, that podium, that microphone, she did it in silence, with no one left to listen. Because justice isn't polite. It doesn't arrive in a neat envelope or with a courteous nod. Justice kicks the door down. It drags the truth into daylight. It shouts from the podium with a trembling voice and dares the world to listen. Justice is what happens when the quietest person in the room decides she's done being silent. And justice never backs down.